The desert at 0530 hours was the color of old bone, not the romantic amber of postcards, not the cinematic gold of war films. It was pale, bleached, the color of something that had been cooked and cooked until all life had drained out of it. The sun hadn't fully crested the ridge yet, but its heat was already arriving ahead of it, a preview, a warning. The kind of morning that told you clearly, this place does not care about you. Sergeant First Class Emily Carter stepped off the transport at Forward Operating Base Ironside and stood still for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to let her eyes adjust, her lungs adjust, her understanding of the place adjust. 3 seconds. Then she picked up her kit bag and walked toward the administrative building without looking at anyone. She was 28 years old, 5'7", light brown hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to flatten her features. Her face was the kind of face that gave nothing away, not hostility, not warmth, not nerves, just stillness. The kind of stillness that some people mistake for blankness and only realize their mistake much later. The administrative clerk, a young specialist named Hargrove with a sunburned neck and a curious expression, processed her transfer paperwork while visibly working up the courage to ask something. He didn't ask. Emily's file listed her previous assignment as Logistics Coordination, 4th Support Battalion. Before that, Administrative Attachment, Fort Bliss. Before that, a gap of 8 months. The gap was labeled, Medical Leave Resolved. Hargrove's eyes paused on it for a moment, then moved on. You're assigned to Bravo Range, he said, sliding a laminated badge across the counter. Advanced Sniper Qualification Course. Reporting to Master Sergeant Vance, he said the name the way people said it here, with a small, involuntary weight attached to it, like the name itself had mass. Start time? Emily asked. 0700. But Hargrove hesitated. Most of the candidates have been here 6 weeks already. This is the final evaluation phase. Emily picked up the badge. Thank you, Specialist. She was halfway out the door when Hargrove said, almost to himself, good luck. She didn't respond to that either. Bravo Range was a half-mile from the main compound, across a stretch of cracked earth that had been worn smooth by 2 decades of boots. It was configured around a long central shooting line, an elevated observation platform, and a series of target frames that stretched out at distances ranging from 300 meters to just over a kilometer. The wind at this hour came from the northwest, consistent, maybe 9 knots, with occasional gusts that pushed it to 14. Emily noted all of this before she crossed the berm. There were 11 candidates in the current cohort. All men, most of them were between 24 and 32, combat tested, with the specific physical ease of people who had been doing hard things for long enough that hard things no longer required visible effort. They stood in small groups near the ammunition table when Emily arrived, and the shift in the group's energy was immediate and unmistakable. Not hostile, not yet. Something more like the brief recalibration that happens when the parameters of a situation change unexpectedly. Then one of them, a broad-shouldered staff sergeant named Garrett Hollis, said something quietly to the man beside him, and 2 others laughed. It was a particular kind of laugh, the kind that doesn't bother to be subtle. Emily walked to the end of the shooting line, set her kit bag down, and began laying out her equipment with methodical attention. She did not look up. Master Sergeant Logan Vance arrived at exactly 0700. He came around the side of the observation platform without announcement, and the 11 candidates straightened immediately, not at attention, exactly, but with the involuntary alertness of people in the presence of someone whose reputation has preceded them by several years. Logan Vance was 43 years old, and he looked like he had been assembled from the landscape itself. Weathered, angular, built economically, with no soft material anywhere. He had served 3 combat deployments as a Navy SEAL before transitioning to training roles, and the transition had not softened him. If anything, it had concentrated him. He scanned the line. His eyes stopped on Emily for exactly as long as they stopped on everyone else. Then he began the morning brief without preamble. This week is not about what you know, he said, his voice flat and carrying without effort. It's about what you do when conditions are against you, when your body is wrong, when the problem has no clean solution. Any candidate who is looking for validation, you're in the wrong place. You're here to be broken down and see what's left. He paused. We have a late addition to the cohort. He did not look at Emily. Sergeant Carter, logistics background. She'll be evaluated alongside the rest of you. Garrett Hollis did not laugh this time. He simply looked at the ground with the faint smile of someone who doesn't need to say anything because the situation has already said it for him. The morning's first session was a warm-up, a battery of known distance shots at 500 meters, standard conditions, more diagnostic than challenging. The point was baseline establishment. Vance walked the line slowly while the candidates worked, observing not just the shots but the mechanics, the breathing patterns, the way each person handled the weight of the rifle. Emily shot last. She settled behind the M24 with the practiced ease of someone returning to a familiar language. Adjusted the bipod by 3 millimeters. Checked the wind indicator at the range's midpoint, let 3 seconds pass. Fired. 497 meters. Edge of the 9 ring. She adjusted the elevation dial by a quarter minute. Fired again. Center mass. Vance did not say anything. He moved on, but she had seen him pause. Just for a fraction of a second, just long enough. At the midday break, Garrett Hollis sat across from her in the shade of the rain shelter and said, pleasantly, "So what's the plan here, Carter? You trying to qualify for something? Or is this a box check?" Emily opened her water bottle. Qualifying? For what role, specifically? She looked at him for a moment. The one at the end of this course. Hollis smiled. He had an easy smile, the kind that usually meant confidence but sometimes meant something smaller masquerading as confidence. Right, well, good luck with that. The last 2 weeks have been. He made a gesture that communicated brutal without requiring the word. You've got a lot of catching up to do. I understand, Emily said. She screwed the cap back on the water bottle. She didn't say anything else for the rest of the break. On the third day, Vance changed the format. He announced it at 0630 before the day's shooting had begun, while the candidates were still assembling at the range. His voice had its usual flatness, no prefatory warning, no building toward it, just the announcement itself, already underway before most of them had finished their coffee. Afternoon session will be individual assessment. I'll call each candidate forward for a single stage evaluation. Scoring is pass-fail. Criteria will be disclosed at the time of the evaluation. He looked down the line. Carter, you're first. The silence that followed had a texture to it. Not surprise, exactly. More like the collective stillness of people watching something that might be worth watching. Emily was second from the left end of the line. She did not change her expression. Yes, Sergeant. At 1,400 hours, the full cohort was assembled on the elevated observation platform, standing in a loose row along the railing. The temperature was 104 degrees. The heat came up off the packed earth in visible waves, and the light had that mid-afternoon quality that turned everything slightly two-dimensional, like a photograph of a place rather than the place itself. Vance stood at the far end of the platform, facing outward toward the range. Emily stood below, at the firing position, holding her assigned rifle, an M2010, chambered in .300 Winchester Magnum. Vance had set the target at 840 meters. To be clear about what this means, 840 meters in a crosswind environment is not a beginner's shot. It is not an intermediate shot. With the conditions present that afternoon, a sustained 11-knot wind from the northwest with irregular gusts, a mirage effect from surface heat that made distance estimation unreliable, and a target face that had been reduced from the standard 18-inch circle to 12, it was the kind of shot that would be considered exceptional for any candidate in the cohort, including the ones who had been training for 6 weeks. Garrett Hollis had made the walk from the platform to the firing position behind Emily, not because he'd been asked to, but because nobody had told him not to. He stopped 5 feet away, arms crossed, and said nothing. His presence was commentary enough. One of the other candidates, a lean, quiet specialist named Derek Yount, said under his breath, from the platform, "That's not a qualification shot, that's a gotcha." Nobody responded. But nobody disagreed. Vance descended the platform steps and walked to a position where he could observe both the shooter and the target. He stopped 12 feet from Emily. "The evaluation is a single shot," he said. "Conditions are as presented. Scoring criteria. Center mass, strike on the reduced target at 840 meters. You have 2 minutes to prepare." He looked at her, and his expression was neither hostile nor encouraging. It was simply present. "Whenever you're ready." Then, very deliberately, he said, "Prove it." He said it without particular emphasis, without drama, as if it were simply the name of the task. The word landed differently on everyone who heard it. On the men on the platform, it registered as a kind of summation. This is what it comes down to. On Hollis, standing nearby with his arms crossed, it seemed to satisfy something. On Vance himself, his face revealed nothing of what he intended by it. Emily heard it the same way she heard everything, receiving it fully, processing it completely, and producing no visible external response. Vance took the M2010 from the equipment rack and set it on the shooting mat. He did not hand it to her gently. He set it down with a controlled, deliberate force that stopped just short of being an insult. It was the kind of action that communicated, "You asked to be here, now be here." Emily looked at the rifle. She picked it up. What the observers on the platform saw, what they would later describe with varying degrees of accuracy, was a woman lying behind a rifle, apparently doing nothing, for an unusually long time. What was actually happening was something more specific. Emily Carter settled into prone position with a practiced efficiency that took less than 4 seconds. Her left elbow placement was precise to the millimeter. Her cheek weld was consistent with a shooter who had performed the same action thousands of times, not someone rehearsing, but someone returning. The rifle became an extension of her body the way a familiar tool becomes part of the hand that holds it. She looked through the scope, then she looked away from the scope. This was the part that Hollis, watching from 5 feet away, found strange enough to mention later. She took her eye off the glass and simply looked downrange with her naked eye for several seconds at the heat shimmer, at the wind indicator at the range's midpoint, at a second indicator she had apparently noticed earlier, near the 600-meter berm, a small orange streamer barely visible in the distortion. She was reading the conditions in layers. The sustained wind was 11 knots from the northwest, but the gusts were irregular and brief, 3 to 5 seconds in duration, with intervals of roughly 8 to 12 seconds between them. The heat mirage at the target's distance was moving left to right, which was consistent with the surface temperature but inconsistent with the upper air component of the wind, suggesting a slight variation in wind direction at altitude, not dramatic, but enough to matter at this distance. She already knew all of this. She had been cataloging it since 1100 hours, 3 hours earlier, when the afternoon wind had shifted and she had noticed without appearing to notice. Emily rested her cheek back against the stock. She closed her eyes for 2 seconds. The inside of her eyelids was orange-red from the desert light. She was 9 years old. Her father was behind her, his hands on her shoulders, not correcting, just present. The rifle in front of her was a .22 bolt action, far too big for her proportionally, and he had propped it on a sandbag so she didn't need the arm strength yet. "You're not fighting the gun," he had said. "You're asking it a question. The bullet is the answer." His name was Master Sergeant James Carter, 75th Ranger Regiment, and he smelled like coffee and gun oil, and he had 3 years left to live. And she hadn't known that then. She opened her eyes, the crosshairs settled on the 12-inch circle, 840 meters away. She did not feel anything in particular. She had long ago learned to distinguish between the body's noise and the body's signal. And right now the signal was simple and clear. The conditions were present. The moment was available. The question had been asked. Behind her, Garrett Hollis shifted his weight impatiently. She waited. A gust came, peaked, fell away. The streamer at 600 meters went briefly still. The mirage at the target's distance shifted slightly right. She exhaled half a breath and held it. Her finger touched the trigger, not gripped, touched, the way you might touch a surface to determine its temperature. The gust interval had begun. She had approximately 6 seconds. She began the trigger pull. The M2010 fired. The sound was sharp and immediate. A crack that the desert absorbed quickly, the way it absorbed everything. Without echo, without return. Emily remained in position. There was no drama in her body. No flinch, no lift, no recoil-driven motion that she then had to recover from. She stayed behind the glass, watching downrange, her breathing steady and unchanged. 1 second. Tfo. The travel time of a .300 Winchester Magnum round at 840 meters, accounting for standard atmospheric drag and a 14-degree temperature elevation above sea level, is approximately 1.1 to 1.2 seconds. 3 seconds had passed. The target was 840 meters away. At this distance, under these conditions, with the midday heat shimmer and the surface distortion, the human eye could not reliably confirm a hit from the firing position. You needed glass. You needed someone on the spotting scope. Vance had the spotting scope. He had it raised to his eye before the shot was fired, standard observation procedure. He was watching the target face, waiting for the moment of impact or its absence. He watched. The spotter system they used at Ironside had a magnification range that allowed reasonably clear confirmation at this distance. At 840 meters, what you saw was not a hole. What you saw was a disruption, a sudden dark mark appearing on the painted steel, like a period placed in the middle of a sentence. Logan Vance lowered the spotting scope. He looked at Emily, who was still in her firing position, still behind the glass, still motionless. He raised the scope again. He looked for a long time, then he lowered it. His face had changed in the way that faces change when something unexpected has happened. Not a dramatic change, not an expression of emotion, but a subtle reorganization, the kind that happens before the brain has finished processing and before the will has had a chance to intervene. On the platform above, Derek Yount had his own binoculars to his eyes. He said, quietly, "Center." Nobody moved. Yount lowered the binoculars and looked at the man beside him. "Center mass," he said. "Dead center." Garrett Hollis was still 5 feet behind Emily. He had uncrossed his arms at some point, he wasn't sure exactly when. He was looking at the target position with the unfocused gaze of someone trying to parse information that doesn't fit the category they've assigned to it. Emily Carter stood up from the firing position. She cleared the rifle, confirmed chamber empty, and set it back on the mat with the same controlled efficiency with which she had picked it up. Then she stood with her hands at her sides and looked at Vance. Vance said nothing. The silence lasted longer than anyone expected, not because there was nothing to say, because nobody had the right thing ready. This is the specific quality of silence that follows something that rewrites a shared assumption. It is not empty. It is very full. It is full of the sound of everyone present, revising their internal file on what they have just witnessed. On the platform, the 11 candidates stood without moving. The heat pressed down, a distant engine sound, a transport somewhere on the compound perimeter was the only thing that separated the moment from complete stillness. Specialist Derek Yount was the first one to do anything. He walked to the platform steps, descended them, and walked out to the range toward the target. Nobody ordered him to. Nobody stopped him. He walked at a normal pace, as if he were going to check something routine. The walk took 4 minutes. He arrived at the target frame, examined it closely, looked back toward the firing line, and made a brief gesture, a single raised hand, confirmation. Then he walked back. Garrett Hollis had moved, by this time, to a position further from Emily, not obviously, just a gradual drift. The way people sometimes unconsciously create distance from a situation they've misjudged. He was looking at the target frame even though it was too far away to see clearly. Vance had not spoken since the shot was fired. He was looking at Emily with the particular focus of a person who has encountered a discrepancy and is deciding how to handle it. His expression was not warm. It was not hostile. It was the expression of someone who takes information seriously enough to be genuinely uncertain for a moment. Emily looked back at him without particular expectation. She was not waiting for praise. She was not performing indifference. She simply had no investment in what came next, beyond the practical reality that she was still being evaluated and the evaluation was not finished. Above them, on the platform's corner post, the range's directional indicator shifted. The wind had backed to the west. The temperature, by some minor mercy, dropped 2 degrees. A major from the compound's training oversight office had appeared at the platform. Emily hadn't seen him arrive. He must have come from the road while the shot was being processed. His name was Major Calvin Reeves, and he was the kind of officer whose rank had not required very much actual difficulty to obtain. He stood on the platform with his arms behind his back, looking out at the range with the careful expression of a man trying to determine whether what he'd just heard was worth his attention. "Vance," he said. Vance turned. "I want a full report on this session's results by 1800. "Yes, sir." Reeves looked once at Emily, a brief, appraising look that registered nothing in particular, and then walked back the way he had come. By 1600 hours, the story had traveled the length of the compound, not the full story. The compressed version, the kind that passes between people in shorthand. The logistics sergeant hit center at 8:40 in a crosswind. By 1700 it had mutated slightly, as stories do. The transfer from Fort Bliss drilled a 12-inch plate at 900. By 1800, Specialist Hargrove in the administrative building had heard 3 different versions, each more extreme than the last, and none of them quite accurate. Emily was in the barracks by 1700, cleaning her assigned M24 with methodical care. She had no particular feeling about what had happened. She had done what she knew how to do. The distance, the conditions, the target size, these were parameters. She had solved the parameters. That was the entire transaction, as far as she was concerned. She was thinking about the wind shift she had noted before the shot, the upper air variation she had identified from the second streamer. She was thinking about whether it would persist into tomorrow, or whether it was a diurnal pattern that would reset. She was thinking practically. She was not thinking about the silence, but she would remember it for a long time anyway. Logan Vance did not sleep well. This was not unusual. He hadn't slept well in years. A souvenir of his 3rd deployment that he had made a private arrangement with and no longer discussed. But that night he lay awake with a specific wakefulness, the kind that comes from an unresolved professional question rather than an unresolved personal one, which was in some ways more manageable and in some ways worse. The shot should not have been made. He knew this with the precision of someone who had been assessing shooters for 11 years. Not that it was impossible, nothing that had happened was physically impossible. But the combination of factors, the late arrival, the lack of stated preparation, the absence of a structured warm-up to that distance, the wind conditions, placed the probability of a clean center mass strike at that distance, by a shooter of unknown current capability, at something he would have estimated generously at 15%. He had been wrong. Vance handled being wrong the way most good professionals handle it, by taking it seriously. Not with self-flagellation, not with defensive rationalization, but with a straightforward re-examination of the data. The data said, the shot happened. The data said, the conditions were as documented. The data said, The result was confirmed independently by both the spotting scope and a physical examination of the target. Therefore, his prior estimate had been wrong. The question was why. He called for a second evaluation at 0800 the following morning. He announced it the same way he announced everything, without prefatory softening, without explanation. Carter, second evaluation today, 0800. Different parameters. Emily looked up from her pre-session equipment check. Understood. Hollis exchanged a look with another candidate named Bryce Walton. Walton raised an eyebrow slightly. The exchange communicated, he's going to find the edge of what she can actually do. This was partly what Vance intended, but it wasn't quite that simple. It was also, though he would not have framed it this way, a form of respect. You did not do what Emily had done and then get ignored. What you got, if Vance was the one evaluating you, was more attention. The second evaluation was different in structure. The target was placed at 720 meters, slightly shorter, but the parameters were otherwise substantially harder. The target face was 10 inches. The wind had shifted overnight and was now coming from the northeast at an irregular 12 to 16 knots, with a gusting pattern that was less predictable than the previous afternoons. There was no secondary wind indicator. The only reference points were the primary streamer at the midpoint and whatever natural terrain features Emily could use. Additionally, Vance specified a time constraint, 60 seconds from the moment she assumed the firing position. He also changed the rifle. She would use an unfamiliar M110 standard, well maintained, but not the weapon she had used the day before, and he stood where she could see him, watching. Emily took 11 seconds to settle behind the M110. She ran a brief function check, adjusted the cheek rest, checked the elevation turret's 0 marking. She looked downrange. The wind pattern at this hour was different from yesterday's. The surface gusts were coming in pairs, a shorter initial burst followed by a longer sustained push, separated by a gap of roughly 4 to 6 seconds. The gap was shorter than yesterday's intervals. The window she had to work with was tighter. 40 seconds elapsed. On the observation platform, nobody was speaking. Even Hollis had stopped making any communicative gestures to the men around him. He was simply watching. 48 seconds. The crosshairs held at center. Emily waited for the double gust pattern to exhaust itself. Waited for the gap. At 51 seconds, the second gust subsided. She fired. The M110's report was slightly sharper than the M2010's, a different caliber, a different acoustic signature. Then quiet again. Vance was on the spotting scope before the sound had finished. He kept it raised for 6 seconds. Then, he lowered it. He didn't say anything immediately. Then he said, without looking at anyone specifically, 7 ring. Hollis exhaled. Wind shifted at 52 seconds, Vance added. To nobody in particular, it was not a consolation. It was a statement of fact. The gap she identified was real. The shot was on track. The wind moved at firing. He looked at Emily. She had broken position and was making a notation in a small green field notebook, presumably logging the shot, the conditions, the deviation. She looked up, met his eyes, and nodded once. 7 ring was not center mass, but what Logan Vance had just observed was not a failure. What he had observed was the full picture of what the previous day's shot had been. Not luck, not a one-time alignment of favorable circumstances, but a capability operating at its limit, successfully, under conditions specifically designed to find that limit. He thought about the gap in her service record. The 8 months labeled medical leave resolved. He thought about the phrase logistics background. He thought, this does not add up. The records section at Fort Bliss was staffed by a warrant officer named Diane Phelps, who had been handling military personnel documents for 18 years and who had, in that time, developed the professional habit of noticing when a record had been managed. Managed records were not forged records. They were not falsified. They were simply records in which the most salient information had been placed in contexts that made it seem less salient, reductions in grade that appeared to be voluntary separations, training certifications that were filed under administrative categories rather than tactical ones, a gap coded as medical leave that was actually, if you knew what the surrounding dates, corresponded to a reassignment period following the dissolution of a specialized evaluation program. Vance called her at 1930 on a secure line. I've got a sergeant named Emily Carter, he said, transferred to me from 4th Support, prior posting Fort Bliss. I need the actual file. Phelps was quiet for a moment. How much of the actual file? She asked. The answer to that question told Vance something important. You didn't ask how much unless there was a reason not to send all of it at once. Unless the file was layered in ways that complicated transmission. Whatever you can give me, he said. What arrived, 2 hours later, was a partial document, 7 pages, redacted in places, with the signature of a colonel whose name Vance didn't recognize on the authorization section. He read it 3 times. Emily Carter had entered the Army at 22. Standard enlistment, infantry support track. At 24, she had been identified by a talent assessment program and pulled into an accelerated marksmanship track, a program that had existed quietly for 4 years before being defunded. The program's stated purpose was to develop precision shooting capability across branches without the rank or gender restrictions of the standard sniper qualification pathway. She had completed the full curriculum, all of it, including stages that Vance recognized as exceeding the standard sniper qualification requirements by a measurable margin. Then the program had been dissolved, not because of performance. The dissolution had happened for budgetary and reading between the lines of the tightly worded administrative language political reasons. The program had been controversial in certain quarters for the same reason Emily Carter's presence at Bravo Range was controversial. It had systematically violated the informal consensus about who belonged in these roles. When the program ended, its graduates had been reassigned. Most of them went back to their primary specialties, with no record of what they had learned. Emily Carter had gone to Fort Bliss. Her marksmanship training record had been filed under a category that made it effectively invisible to anyone doing a standard background pull. Her 8 months of medical leave resolved corresponded exactly to the period following the program's dissolution and the period during which she had apparently fought, through official channels, to have her qualifications recognized. The fight had been unsuccessful. She had been in logistics for 4 years. Vance set the document down. He sat for a while in the particular stillness of someone who has just discovered that they have been, in a specific and operational sense, complicit in something they did not know they were complicit in. Not deliberately, not maliciously, but complicit nonetheless, in the way that systems ensure complicity by controlling what information reaches the people inside them. He thought about the challenge he had issued. Prove it. He thought about what it must have cost her, not the shot itself, but the years of being in the wrong category, the years of watching her actual capability sit in a file that nobody was allowed to see. He thought about Hollis's easy smile and the laugh that had started on the first morning. He thought about Major Reeves on the platform, looking at Emily with his appraising, empty look, seeing a logistics sergeant out of place. He thought, she has been proving it for years. To people who weren't watching, Vance requested a meeting with Major Reeves at 0700 the following day. He arrived with the 7 pages in a folder, which he set on the desk without preamble. Reeves looked at the folder, then at Vance. Then he opened it. He spent 4 minutes reading. His expression was carefully neutral in the way that carefully neutral expressions sometimes signal a decision already made. "Where did you get this?" he said. "Personnel office at Bliss. Official request." "This program was officially dissolved," Reeves said. "Its records are classified at a level that they were released to me under standard training evaluation protocol," Vance said, "which permits commanding training officers to access relevant personnel records for candidates under evaluation." This was technically accurate. Whether it was precisely within the spirit of the protocol was a different question, and both of them knew it. Reeves closed the folder. He leaned back slightly. "What's your point, Sergeant?" "She's fully qualified. More than qualified. Her certifications exceed standard sniper qualification criteria. Her certifications are from a dissolved program that was never formally integrated into the evaluation pathway. The training happened. The capability exists. I've watched her shoot. 1 good session," Reeves said, "and a 7 ring on the second. The wind shifted at firing on the second evaluation. I documented it." Vance kept his voice level. "It required some effort, sir. She outperformed 8 of the 11 current candidates on the documented metrics from both sessions. If we're running a merit-based evaluation, she should advance." Reeves was quiet. "The program she came from," he said, "eventually, was dissolved for reasons." "I know the reasons. Then you understand the issue." "I understand an issue," Vance said. "I'm not sure it's the right one." He kept his eyes on Reeves. "If she advances because she earned it. If she doesn't, I want the documented reason to be about her performance, and right now, her performance doesn't give us that reason." Another silence. Reeves picked up the folder and placed it on the left side of his desk, the side for active items, not the side for things waiting to be filed. It was a small movement, almost involuntary, but Vance noticed it. "I'll review the full evaluation record," Reeves said. "By end of week." Vance stood. "Thank you, sir." He walked out of the building into the desert morning, and the heat received him the same way it received everything. Without comment, without judgment, without any indication that what had just happened mattered. But it did matter. The folder was on the left side of the desk. The culminating exercise was scheduled for the 4th Friday of the evaluation period, a simulated operational scenario that combined static marksmanship with movement, decision-making under time pressure, and team coordination. The setup was designed to reflect a simplified version of a precision fire support scenario: a mobile threat element, a protected objective, A team of 4 tasked with getting eyes on the objective and neutralizing the threat. Vance had run variations of this exercise for 11 years. He had refined it to the point where it reliably distinguished between candidates who could shoot in controlled conditions and candidates who could shoot when the controlled conditions had been deliberately dismantled. The 4-person teams were assigned by random draw. Emily was placed with Hollis, Yount, and a quiet sergeant from Ohio named Patrick Caldwell who had a gift for navigation and very little to say about most things. They were briefed at 0600. The exercise began at 0700. The first problem presented itself 11 minutes in, when Hollis, who had been assigned the navigation element, brought the team to a position that was close to the objective but positioned against a sun angle that would make their optics nearly useless for the next 45 minutes. It was not a catastrophic error. It was the kind of error that came from prioritizing speed over assessment, a pressure that the exercise was specifically designed to create. Hollis knew it was wrong as soon as they arrived. He stood with his map, working through the recalculation, and the team stood around him in the flat light of early morning and waited. Emily had known it was going to be wrong 4 minutes before they arrived. She had noted the sun angle from the previous ridge and run the geometry in her head and understood where it was leading. She had not said anything. This was its own kind of decision. She waited until Hollis had recognized the error, until he'd had the 30 seconds to work through it himself. Then she said, quietly, "Southwest ridge is 12 minutes back. Higher elevation, the sun angle works from 0730 on. We'd have a clear sight line to the objective from Point Hotel." Hollis looked at her. She pulled out the range card she had prepared during the brief, a series of annotated sketches that mapped the probable approach routes against sun position and terrain. She had prepared it without being asked. It was thorough. Hollis studied it for approximately 8 seconds. "All right," he said. "Southwest ridge." They arrived at Point Hotel at 0721. The sight line to the objective was exactly as Emily had indicated. The sun angle was workable. The team had 42 minutes to observe, establish firing solutions, and wait for the threat element to appear. During those 42 minutes, Emily was on the optics. She made 2 corrections to the initial range estimate based on a reference technique she had learned in the dissolved program, a method of using mirage refraction to verify distance that was not in the standard manual. She explained it to Yount, who was spotting, in approximately 30 words. He understood it immediately and began using it. The threat element appeared at 08073 3 target frames mounted on a moving platform, operated by radio control, designed to simulate movement across the objective's approach corridor. Emily's firing solution was prepared. She had 1 shot. The target was moving at a simulated walking pace, roughly 3 meters per second. The range to the impact point she had selected was 630 meters. The wind had dropped to 7 knots in the morning's relative cool. She tracked the lead target through the scope, calculating the lead time. At 809 to 14, she fired. The target frame stopped. Yount's spotting call came a half second later. Hit. Center. The exercise clock stopped at 809 to 31. Total time from movement initiation to threat neutralization: 2 minutes and 31 seconds, within the target window for a passing result. The evaluating observer, a warrant officer named Tran, who had been following the team from 30 meters back without speaking, made a notation on his tablet and said, "Exercise complete. Return to the rally point." On the walk back, nobody said much. Hollis walked beside Emily for a stretch, and after a while he said, without particular preamble, "That range card was good." Emily glanced at him briefly. "The Southwest Ridge idea was good," he said. "You would have gotten there," she said. "Maybe." He was quiet for a moment. Maybe not in time. He didn't say anything else about it, but he fell into step beside her for the rest of the walk back. And it had a different quality from how he had stood near her at the beginning. Less architecture of exclusion, less deliberate positioning, just 2 people walking in the same direction in the desert morning. Vance received Tran's evaluation report at 1,400 hours. He read it twice. Then he pulled Emily Carter's cumulative scoring across all sessions and laid it against the cohort results. She ranked 2nd overall, behind a meticulous staff sergeant from the 82nd Airborne named Russell Webb, who had been quietly one of the best shooters in the cohort from day one and who would have ranked first in almost any evaluation cohort Vance had run in the past 4 years. Vance made a note on her evaluation form. He sat for a moment. Then he wrote a second note on a different form, the kind of form that went to training oversight rather than to the candidate. And in it he recommended that the evaluation program revisit the integration pathway for candidates from specialized training programs that had been administratively dissolved. He wrote it in the precise, documented language that such recommendations required, and he attached Emily Carter's 7-page personnel document as supporting evidence. He did not know if it would go anywhere. He suspected it might not, at least not quickly. But he wrote it anyway, because the alternative was to be the person who saw the data and made no notation. The results briefing was held the following Monday at 0800 in a room that smelled of coffee and industrial cleaning products and the specific kind of institutional permanence that comes from many years of the same activities in the same space. Vance read the names in order of overall ranking. Russell Webb, first. Emily Carter, second. Derek Yount, third. Patrick Caldwell, fourth. The rest followed. There was the standard distribution of responses: relief, the particular flat affect of people who had expected better, the careful non-reaction of people who were absorbing results they were still processing. After the briefing, the candidates filed out toward the morning's session. Emily was one of the last to leave. She had been writing something in her Greenfield notebook, probably the session results, probably another annotation to add to the accumulation of data she apparently maintained about everything she did. She finished writing, capped the pen, and stood up. Vance was at the door. The room was empty except for the two of them. He said, "You were eligible for this course 2 years ago, based on your certifications from the dissolved program." Emily looked at him. She said nothing. "I wrote a recommendation to the oversight board about the pathway issue," he said. "Whether it changes anything, I don't know." She nodded once. It was not a grateful nod, not a deferential nod. It was simply an acknowledgement I received that information. "The 8 months," he said. It was not quite a question. She was quiet for a moment. "I filed the correct paperwork," she said. "Multiple times. The certifications existed. The pathway didn't. I know. I stopped filing the paperwork eventually," she said, "and requested the logistics posting, because I needed employment, and the paperwork wasn't working." She paused. "I didn't stop being able to shoot." There it was. The whole story in 4 sentences. Vance had been in the military for 21 years, and in those years he had met people who had been failed by systems in ways both small and significant, and he had sometimes been part of those systems without fully seeing his part in them, and the knowledge of this was something he carried without particular drama because that was the only way to carry it and continue functioning. He said, "You already proved it." The sentence was simple. It did not contain an apology, because an apology from him specifically was not precisely the right instrument for what needed to be acknowledged. The problem was larger than him and its solution was larger than him. What the sentence contained instead was the specific weight of a person in authority who has looked at the record accurately and said so out loud. Emily looked at him for a moment. Then she looked away, out the single window, toward the desert, and the range and the heat that was already building toward the day's maximum. "I know," she said. She said it the way she said most things, without inflection, without performance, as simple fact. She had known it before she arrived. She had known it for 4 years in logistics, for 8 months of paperwork, for all the time she had spent in the correct categories on the wrong side of an invisible line. The knowing had never been the issue. Outside, the desert was doing what it always did. The sun was at its mid-morning position, and the range was active, and the sounds of the morning's qualification session carried across the compound in the clean desert air, the flat percussion of rifles, the brief silences between shots, the distant call of spotters confirming results. Emily walked down the range road toward Bravo Range, her kit bag over one shoulder, her field notebook in her back pocket. The wind was from the northwest again, 8 knots, cooler than yesterday. Good conditions. She passed Garrett Hollis near the ammunition point. He was checking his equipment, moving through the pre-session routine with the practiced efficiency he had. He looked up when she passed. He nodded. Not a big nod. Not a speech. Not an acknowledgement that required any particular display. Just a nod, the kind that one professional gives to another when the record has been reviewed and the assessment has been revised. She nodded back. She kept walking. At the firing line, she set her kit bag down in her usual position second from the left end and began laying out her equipment in the order that suited the day's requirements. She checked the wind indicator, made a note, checked the secondary indicator she had identified on day 2 of the course, the one that gave her the additional data point at the mid-range position. The morning session would begin in 11 minutes. She had work to do. The desert received this, her presence, her preparation, her quiet industry, the same way it received everything else. Without fanfare, without comment, without the need to underline its own significance. She had a shot to prepare for. She prepared for it. That was enough. The target at 840 meters stood in the heat shimmer. The desert kept its silence. Not because nothing had happened, because some things are too exact for noise.